Spoilers, spoilers, spoilers. This video has spoilers for Wonka. If you watch it, you will get spoiled, so make sure you've seen the film first. Paul King, he's why it works. Prior to Wonka, King made 3 movies, and the most recent 2 are the Paddington films, which you should watch if you haven't already, because they're both great movies, and the second one is genuinely a perfect movie. Prior to Wonka, King had yet to disappoint, so there probably shouldn't have been much doubt as to Wonka's quality. However, the trailers did not inspire confidence, or even show the film was a musical, and the Wonka prequel just sounded like a terrible idea. These types of movies have been made many times before, where they took a supporting character from a popular movie or film series and gave them their own movie. These movies tended to not be any good because it's hard to make a side character compelling as a protagonist when they were designed to be a side character. Alongside not having compelling protagonists, these films tended to not feel very impactful because the viewer already knows what will happen to the characters after this. Lastly, and in my opinion most importantly, they tended to just not be interesting movies. Paul King and company avoid all of these issues and more, but I'm not really going to focus on the and more part by having a compelling protagonist, feeling impactful, and just generally making a good movie. To start with the compelling protagonist side of things, Wonka first does stuff by focusing on the right. Nope, scratch that, reverse it. Usually, a movie like Wonka would throw in details like how Wonka got his hat or how he got his name, and those just feel like they'd be weird additions to the movie. Both Solo, A Star Wars Story, and Cruella do this, and those movies have other issues too, but the way those films focus on tying back to the version of the characters and stories we already know makes those films feel like they care more about filling in gaps than telling an actually good and interesting story. When Wonka does have moments like this, like the Oompa Loompa song or Pure Imagination or the factory at the end, it doesn't feel like the film relying on those references as a crutch so the audience will get the fun little nostalgia dopamine release. It instead feels like the filmmakers wanting to pay their respects to the original film. Nextly, Wonka does right by leaving some things as a mystery. The film doesn't lead directly to Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, leaving about 20 to 30 years between the 2 films, and the version of Wonka in this movie isn't the same as the version of him in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Not because Timothée Chalamet doesn't look exactly like Gene Wilder, but because this version has much less of a weird side than the version in the Gene Wilder movie, so something clearly happened between these 2 films, and I'm glad the film leaves whatever happened a mystery. A movie like Solo leaves time between its ending and Han's appearance in A New Hope, but it leaves much less of a time jump, close to a decade, and intentionally ties itself to what we know about Han from the mainline Star Wars movies, to the point where it makes connecting to the mainline movies one of its major goals, if not its main one. Lastly, Wonka adds and removes elements of Willy Wonka to make him a compelling protagonist, while still feeling true to the Gene Wilder portrayal. Wonka doesn't feel limited by Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and the film gives Wonka things like internal and external conflict and motivation for why he wants to make chocolate. At the same time, the Wonka of this movie feels like he could conceivably become the version portrayed by Gene Wilder, because Timothée Chalamet's portrayal has the same sense of whimsy as the original version, just without some of the darkness probably attained by the aforementioned 20 to 30 year gap between stories. Contrast this with a film like Cruella, which does not do anything to make me think this version of the character will harm puppies, and that makes me like this version of the character more, but also makes me not believe Emma Stone's version of the character can ever become the version from the animated movie, or even Glenn Close for that matter. So everything I just said is how Wonka the character works, but how does Wonka the movie actually have any impact on the wider world of Willy Wonka works when we already know what happens to this guy? Well, for starters, it has a lot of other characters who are not in any other Wonka stories for the viewer to latch onto, specifically Noodle and the indentured servants. Even if I didn't care about them much on their own, maybe aside from Noodle, I cared about this group because Wonka cared about them, and I cared about Wonka. Speaking of, next point, I cared about Wonka. Like I said earlier, Wonka has motivation and internal and external conflict in this movie to make me care about him. Even though this film is a prequel, I still care about what happens to him. It's similar to rewatching a good movie. I still get invested in the story even though I know where it's going, as I assume many of you do too. I cared about Wonka and wanted him to succeed, and I felt bad for him at any instance where he failed, like when he first opened his shop. Because of that segue, I didn't want to interrupt to talk about other prequels, but I can't say I really cared about the characters in either Solo or Cruella, and also Fantastic Beasts if we can count that. Solo's main character motivation is based on a relationship we know doesn't pan out, and also one which doesn't get fleshed out. Also, his character arc comes in A New Hope, so this movie can't really make him a hero. And with Cruella, it's, again, the dog killer thing, and also none of the supporting characters are very compelling, because the one character Cruella cares about in this movie is the one who died at the beginning of the film, and we don't really get a good sense of Cruella's 2 friends' wants and needs, whereas with Wonka, we get all of that. The whole gang wants to get out of indentured servitude, and Noodle wants to have a home and a family. It isn't a ton of stuff or the most complicated and compelling character motivations ever put to film, but it's motivation the audience can understand and empathize with, and that's what really matters in life. Lastly, the film works despite knowing what happens to Wonka because it's a really interesting film. It's a unique story and I couldn't tell where it was going. A movie like Fantastic Beasts 2 is about finding objects revealing a person's lineage, and it fails at being an interesting movie, which the first one actually did a fairly good job of. I don't really care about the characters of this franchise, I don't feel any stakes because I already know how the story will end, and the movie just isn't enjoyable to watch. On the other hand, Wonka's third act is a heist, and the film has a chocolate cartel who buy off the police with their chocolate supply. It's a very unique movie, and it's also a really good movie, and that was hopefully a really good segue. While Wonka works for everything I just said, it works the most because it's a good movie. Wonka is a good movie because it's well written and directed, has a lot of interesting shots and lighting and scenes, and a lot of clever jokes you would expect from the guy who wrote and directed the Paddington movies. Contrast this with Solo, which feels very average on the writing side of things, and pretty good on the direction, though it doesn't stand out too much. Wonka also feels sincere. In its humor, characters, and story, Wonka feels like a movie made by people who have a love for the film they are making and the story they are telling. The film doesn't make fun of itself, and it doesn't in any way feel embarrassed about its story. It embraces wholeheartedly the story it tells and the characters who move through it, and it leans into the weirdness and absurdity of its premise, enhancing the experience rather than taking the audience out of it. There's a moment near the end of the movie where Wonka opens a Wonka bar and finds out the secret ingredient is, it's not the chocolate that matters, it's the people you share it with. In almost any other movie, this type of reveal wouldn't work. It's predictable and cliche, and it totally got me. Not got me to cry, but got me to choke up, and probably on rewatch will get me to cry. The film's complete sincerity and commitment to its characters makes the audience take this moment seriously, because it's clear the filmmakers do too. And then he looks up and sees his mom, but she disappears because she was never really there, but she'll always be with him and love him, and he smiles and he cries and he gives the chocolate to his friends, and the Willy Wonka prequel movie should not be this good, but I guess that's just Paul King for you. This point is more of a comment on things like the Marvel movies and their particular style of dialogue, often making fun of the absurdity they exist in, but it also fits Fantastic Beasts, which cannot be satisfied being a fun series where a guy goes around finding cool magical creatures and has to be about Grindelwald and Dumbledore and their rivalry, while still shoehorning in Newt's commander. I don't think Fantastic Beasts entirely fits what I'm talking about, I'll be honest, but I don't think most prequels are as insincere as Marvel movies tend to be, they just aren't as sincere as Wonka. Lastly, Wonka is good because it has a theme. Theme is one of the most important elements to a story, so much so that almost no good movie can exist without one, and Wonka genuinely cares about its main theme. Wonka works because it isn't about Willy Wonka first and story second, it's about the value of dreams in a system working against dreamers, and the dreamer the film focuses on happens to be Willy Wonka. Wonka's theme is what spoke to me the most about the movie, and what made the film stick with me more than something like Solo, A Star Wars Story, or the two Fantastic Beasts movies I watched, which don't really feel like they have much of a theme because they feel more like world-building vehicles than genuine stories. I think all of us can relate to having dreams, and I think we know how hard it is to actually achieve them. Wonka shows the harsh reality of the world in its own way, but it also shows Willy Wonka succeed against the odds and make it in this industry that doesn't want him, and it tells us we might be able to make it too. A lot of prequel movies, especially ones about established characters from previous films who are designed to be side characters, are not good. Some are, like Andor, which is a show but is a seemingly unnecessary prequel about an established character showing what made him the version of the character the audience is already familiar with, and it's really good. And even the prequels mentioned here have positive aspects to them and get some of these things right, but many don't do enough with their lead to make them a compelling lead, don't do anything to make the story compelling and worth telling, and most just aren't interesting as movies. Wonka is all of these, with a mysterious hat and a compelling lead who doesn't take away from the mystery of the later version of the character and is different enough to work as a protagonist, a story with original characters, a protagonist you care about despite knowing where he ends up, an interesting and unique story, a really good movie with good writing and direction, a big heap of sincerity, and a compelling and resonant theme that connects with audiences of all ages and backgrounds. So basically, Paul King did it again.